It's an absolute joy to welcome Simon Yugler to the Fifth Direction. Simon and I have kind of been orbiting around one another for the last couple of years. I think we first met virtually through Ian Mackenzie in the School of Mythopoetics. And
Absolutely.
yeah, it was wonderful to kind of sit in some gatherings with Simon and listen to your wisdom, brother. You have this amazing kind of combination of being a depth psychologist, but also working extensively with psychedelic medicines, and there's this beautiful blend there. And so maybe a wonderful place to start is maybe if you could just introduce yourself a little bit to our community and a little bit about where you've come from and what you do.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Asher. Yeah, that container with Ian was a really special one. So yeah, it's definitely spaces like that, that are intentional spaces for people to gather around things like myth and story, and inner work, that's really close to my heart. So yeah, I'll just share like a little bit about my story, and where I come from, and we'll take it from there. So yeah, like I'm a depth psychotherapist, so my training, is in kind of a Jungian and archetypal foundation of psychology. But before that, years before that, I had the fortune of actually visiting Australia as a young whippersnapper of 20, and went up to Arnhem Land actually and lived in an Aboriginal community with the Yolngu people. And it was the Didge that brought me down there, but I was able to actually get money from my university to go and do some anthropological research with that community up there. Yarkala was the community I was living in. And that experience kind of set my life, on a course that, has taken me all over the world, to the Middle East and East and Southern Africa and South America and back to Australia and New Zealand and, all over. So, so much of my life has really, I've been just blessed with a lot of travel and a lot of time spent with Indigenous people, Indigenous communities. And a part of that, has also been what I would call like the red road or the medicine ways, so here in North America, we have the Native American church, which is a peyote tradition, that I've been fortunate enough to have some encounters with. It's a really powerful, beautiful tradition of prayer that a lot of Native people hold really beautifully here. And also, the Shipibo ayahuasca tradition down in the Peruvian Amazon, where I was fortunate enough to kind of attend this, where I would call like a ayahuasca boot camp, for a month and a half of being in the jungle and doing the traditional Shipibo dieta and drinking heaps of medicine, and all sorts of other things, and so it was actually through that experience, I had a lot of depth psychology lectures and things from people like Hillman and Robert Moore and all sorts of people kind of rattling around my consciousness, leading up to that experience. And through being in the jungle, doing this intensive work, still reading a lot of books while I was down there, something really clicked. And, just became very clear that, a big part of my life, it didn't feel right for me to be the guy pouring cups of ayahuasca and sort of passing them, handing them out. But, I would be more than happy to be the bridge to that person who to me should be Indigenous, but also that, the intersection of depth and Jungian psychology with these shamanic medicine traditions would be just part of my life's work. And so since then, that was back in 2015. And since then, I continued to travel and kind of had a stint of time doing, kind of initiatory travel work for young adults on gap year semester trips. And then enrolled in a school here in the States called Pacifica Graduate Institute, which is kind of a Jungian and mythopoetic graduate school, that trains people to be psychotherapists and psychologists and whatnot, which really gave me that kind of professional foundation to finally kind of get back to these earlier experiences with indigenous peoples and with, traditional plant medicine and ceremony. And it's just been good ever since, I guess.
Yeah, it's amazing to listen to you, because I love that kind of weaving between those two areas. I think it's beautiful, and to me, it makes perfect sense. So you were kind of interested in Hillman and Robert Moore, like a long time before you ended up at Pacifica, and a long time before you were sitting with these indigenous people and in community, etc. So how did what first drew you to their work, if it was prior to all that?
In high school, when I was maybe 16 or 17, I was lucky enough to take like a psychology course. And, my teacher, it was sort of a survey of the foundation of psychology. And, we kind of went through all of the different theories that were developed by people like Freud, Jung, Erikson, Adler, etc. But it was the Jungian bit of that course that really opened my mind. I remember analyzing a dream, at that age, and I still remember the dream to this day. And just, ever since then, it was just like, oh yeah, like Carl Jung is my guy, and, from the get-go. And I've always been interested in myth. I've always been interested in, the mystery and the unknown, and sort of the more, let's say, shadowy parts of the human experience. And so yeah, learned about Jung in high school, and then the more that I found myself studying things like anthropology, comparative religion, I majored in anthropology and minored in religion at university, and Jung is kind of adjacent to all of those things, especially in religion. Some of those foundational scholars like Mircea Eliade, right? It's just like a hop, skip, and a jump to Joseph Campbell and then to Jung. So, and Michael Meade is local to the Northwest where I live. So, I encountered Michael Meade at a festival that happened here in the Northwest, in the Portland area, called Beloved. And Michael Meade would come and sort of be this kind of resident elder, this resident storyteller. And that's how I got exposed to Michael, and, started going to a lot of his in-person events and workshops in Seattle and Portland, and just dove in, realized that Michael was actually this kind of local treasure, right, that we have here. And, and yeah, just really dove into his work, and was fortunate enough to discover the work of Martin Shaw back in grad school days, which really saved my life in the depths of grad school, just being overwhelmed with, so much material that wasn't feeding my soul. To find Martin's work at that time was really, really special. And then I've just been overjoyed, to see folks like yourself and folks like Ian McKenzie, kind of this upsurge of interest in the mythopoetic has just really warmed my heart.
Yeah, it really is an upsurge. It really is a new rising, and it feels beautiful to be a part of it. But listening to your story there, brother, it just feels so destined, doesn't it? You must truly feel like you're on your soul's calling, so to speak. It just kind of feels like, from a Jungian synchronicity point of view, everything just feels like it's fallen into place.
It On good days, it feels that way. But one crazy story that I'll share, just as far as the synchronistic element goes, all of that Jungian and depth audio that I shared about earlier, especially the Hillman talks and some of these other talks that I had just been given access to, I listened to those to like prime myself to go into the Amazon, and that was such a sort of influential element to my experience down there. At the time, I had never heard of Pacifica, but I later found out that most of those talks were recorded at Pacifica. And at the time, I didn't even know the place existed. So yeah, talk about synchronicity.
Yeah, you must have. I think you were talking to me about a time when you're kind of sitting in the library there and just feeling into where you were and what was around you and all the archival material that sits there. It's kind of like a beautiful little vault of everything mythopoetic, isn't it?
There is literally a vault there, a temperature controlled archive of material, recordings and tapes, of events that Hillman and Bly and all these folks did, and they have Joseph Campbell's desk, his writing desk there, and Joseph Campbell's tarot cards and his personally underlined copies of Jung's books, so it's cool. It's a cool place.
Oh, that is really cool. In fact, Campbell's little book, The Portable Jung, is one of my favorites actually. It's a lovely little gem, isn't it? Yeah. So, look, I think I'd love to hear you talk a little bit how fast forwarding how you've kind of brought these things together. And I recently sat in a workshop with which you ran around mythopoetic integration, and I think you've just so beautifully kind of knitted all these worlds together and come up with this kind of, I guess, framework, for want of a better word. And I'd love for you to kind of very briefly kind of describe what that's all about, if that's possible.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as far as that workshop goes, what I think something that I'm trying to do there, and specifically with regards to psychedelic integration, is to give people a way, and I do this in my own work individually, but really to teach people how to think symbolically and how to think mythopoetically, because we all know that these psychedelic experiences can be very rich in imagery and very sort of visionary, and so giving people a kind of framework to understand how to work with images, which is just such a foundational element to Jungian work. That to me, it just seems like such a valuable skill to bring to psychedelic work. But also, going deeper than that, kind of deeper than just the individual psyche and the individual unconscious is the collective. And even beneath that, the kind of animistic, interwoven nature of it all, right? Which is kind of where all these traditions eventually lead us to, right? Is the participatory nature of the world and reality, and the great story that we're all a part of, and bringing that perspective to psychedelic work, because without it, we really run the risk of making altered states work and psychedelic experiences these sort of little silos of individual healing, which I think is a mistake. So the mythopoetic lens, and beneath that, the animistic lens even, provides an avenue out of our kind of individual fixation on the individual psyche and our individual wounds and traumas to, like I said, the great story, and trying to find our place in it through our own experiences.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. You know, I sometimes feel that there's this kind of in this kind of traumadelic culture which we live in at the moment, that it seems to be very focused on the individual, you know, and the
Yes.
individual suffering and how do we fix the individual. And I love the idea that, you know, mythopoetics and the animist point of view just brings in so much more than that, you know, looking at it from this broader Jungian perspective. So that's a beautiful thing. But also, you know, what I'm hearing from you is that there's this, you know, we tend to try to rationalize everything and see everything through kind of the framework of logos, you know, and
Hmm.
it's impossible to do that with a psychedelic experience. You know, it's speaking to you in the language of soul and metaphor and myth and you know, nature-based symbols and things. So without that, the training that you're bringing in, which is exposing people to that language and helping them to understand it, I think it just makes psychedelic work so much more difficult, right?
Hmm.
If not
Hmm.
impossible, frankly.
Right. I mean, the model that is kind of being rolled out currently, both in the States and in Australia, is this sort of research-oriented model of, person on the bed with the eye shades in a little cube with, someone sitting there, and while that's great for research because the point of that model is to reduce variables, right? Like that's where that comes from, is a sort of research orientation where you want to reduce all the variables so you can measure things, you know, scientifically. From a mythopoetic, animistic, ecological, interrelated lens, I mean, that's absurd because, like, what about the butterfly that is flying from, hundreds of miles away to greet you in that moment when you need it most, you know?
Mm. Mm. Yeah, it's this kind of addiction we have to this kind of reductionist model, isn't it? So we can study everything under a microscope, which doesn't lend itself too well to psychedelics and those types of medicines. It's interesting just to witness it. You're right. You know, in Australia, we've kind of reached a real um, inflection point at the moment because obviously we're moving towards, you know, legalizing um, psilocybin and MDMA and literally in the next couple of months. And so there's an awful lot happening here, and the spotlight is. And I believe we're the first country in the world to do this, you know. But you're right. When I look at the models that are going to be rolled out, that's exactly what it talks about, you know. So we take the medicine one day, and we're lying on a couch, um, um, and the next day we come back and we kind of have an integration conversation with the doctor, and for me it feels like we come back the next day and we try to make rational sense of what just happened the day before, which seems slightly counterintuitive to me.
Yeah, and integration is necessary and vital and beautiful, right? And we lose so much when we don't have that, but also, there's an element, that Hillman kind of spoke to with regards to dreams, which is, to interpret the dream is to kill the dream, and to kind of wrap the dream in this box of understanding to sort of extract our egoic needs from it, maybe does a certain kind of damage to the experience,
Mm.
And I'm all for, like, applying the lessons of psychedelic experiences to your daily life. Of course, absolutely. And there is an element that I think we should all be wary of that is so insidious in our culture, which is the energy, or one could say even the myth of extraction. What can I get from this without giving anything back? That to me is where the slippery slope of failure begins.
Yeah, it's subtle, isn't it? And I agree exactly with what you just said there, because clearly integration is vital. And I guess what we're talking here is the nuances of how that happens. And actually, quite recently, I listened to you talk about the importance of community in that process as well, which I think is what's so beautiful about, you know, what Ian's doing with the School of Mythopoetics, what we're doing with the Fifth Direction, is that really the underlying substrate beneath all of it is doing it in community, you know. And so I think with the integration part, that too plays a vital role. And I'd love you to speak to that, this idea of community.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we were kind of touching on it earlier about kind of this model that, my state of Oregon and now Australia is really sort of, hitching their wagon to, of this kind of research-based model, which is a certain thing. It's a material reductionist approach that is oriented around you and your problems. And you're going to take this little pill with this mysterious powder in it, and it's going to fix you, and you're going to, heal, and then just be more productive at your tech job. The end. And I think that story is extremely problematic, because I don't think, this is the hot take that I'll say, which is I don't think psychedelics are for improving mental health outcomes. I don't. I think that's a dangerously reductionistic approach to these medicines, and something that those of us with a kind of mythopoetic sensibility towards these things, should be speaking up about. It's like, well, they're not just for reducing depression, they're also living beings that grow and die, and perhaps have an agency of their own, and want things of us as well. And so as far as community goes, I don't know, Asher. I think this is part of the kind of frontier that we're at collectively, of like, what can this look like? I would just say, it has to look like something, because the sort of model that is being promoted here is not a model of community. It's a model of individual pathology. And I think we've had enough of that. I think we've had enough of the lone hero or the lone wolf or whatever you want to call it, right? Like, there's another way. Even like thinking about Sophie Strand's work, the myco, eco, mytho intersection of these things. Mushrooms are mycelial beings that are, by their very nature, interwoven with other life forms. So just in their like biological place in our ecologies, they are beings of interrelationship. So I don't know. I don't want to get too far out, but like perhaps the mushrooms want us to mirror some element of that mycorrhizal, intersectionality in our relationships and our community, and the dispersal of nutrients and ideas and information. And yeah, who knows?
Well,
only the mushrooms know.
Yeah, it's true, but it doesn't seem far-fetched at all. In fact, I asked the question, why wouldn't they want that? It makes perfect sense. It's almost hard when you look at it through that lens to argue the other way, right? And I think that,
Yeah.
and I think that's what we're doing here. When we've seen kind of modern medicine, it is all about the individual, isn't it? On all fronts. So I think this is a fascinating discussion, and I loved what you were saying there around for me, I'm hearing kind of what happens beyond the hero. What happens beyond the hero, because we've worked in the hero myth and even the flip side of that, the victim myth, for so long now. That maybe that is the calling and the advent of these new medicines coming in. Maybe part of it is this idea of our collective identity, if you will.
Yeah, I'm working on a book right now about mythology and psychedelics, and I've kind of identified 3 cultural myths, 3 stories that our culture tells itself that I think need to end. One of which is the myth of the lone hero, the other being the myth of extraction, and the other being the myth of material reductionism or disconnection, and I think those 3 stories are all leading to this kind of these converging crises that we're all sitting with, things like climate change, you know, depression and suicide, public violence, right? There are mythic elements to all these things that need to profoundly shift.
Wow, I'm looking forward to hearing more about the book, brother. Do you have kind of a timeline, or is it one of those organic things that's just happening as it can?
There is there's a rough timeline. I mean, quite a lot. Quite a lot has been written, you know, and I'm in a few conversations with some publishers at the moment. But yeah, I'm excited about it.
Well, yeah, so am I now. That sounds wonderful. Yeah. So, I mean,
Yeah.
shifting gears a bit, Simon. What if I was to come and see you? And like, what would happen? How would you go about things? Like we've talked about kind of the medical model and what we're seeing roll out in countries like yours and mine. But what would happen if I was to come and see you?
Well, it depends what you're coming to see me for, you
Sure.
know.
Yeah.
Um,
Let's say it was to involve psychedelic medicine.
hmm Yeah, that's a good question. You know, again, I think this work wants to be done in community. So I'm particularly interested and am currently working with, you know, various training programs here in Oregon that train psychedelic facilitators. And there's a deeper level to that work that I know all of my students are craving, which is kind of ongoing community ritual, basically. But if you were to come to me individually, you know, we would set up about a month's worth of preparation sessions, you know, and then I also have a ketamine assisted psychotherapy practice. So I personally, you know, am weary to just give people large doses of psilocybin right off the bat. And I really like working with ketamine as a therapist because it's kind of like psychedelic training wheels in the sense that it's short acting, it's relatively pleasant, you know, not a lot of difficult unconscious content comes up, and yet it provides a doorway to familiarize oneself with being in altered states of consciousness. And I've seen incredible things happen with that work. And then, you know, it's all about the relationship, right? Like it's the relationship that heals, the relationship between us that heals in a psychotherapeutic context, and then the relationship to the medicine that also heals, you know, the trust there, the familiarity with the contours and rhythms of whatever medicine, right? So I like to kind of go at a slow pace, if that makes sense.
Mm. No, absolutely, absolutely. And I've heard you talk a little bit about what to look for in a psychedelic facilitator as well. And you even talked about it archetypally, which I thought was quite beautiful. But I'm wondering for people listening, if you could share a little bit about that as well.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to recall the three archetypes that I was writing about. One of them, yeah, right, okay. So yeah, I kind of identified these three kind of archetypal polarities of leadership in a psychedelic guide or a psychedelic context, roughly inspired by some of Robert Moore's work, but also not, you know. And as far as that first archetypal polarity, I would call it between the guru and the sovereign. The sovereign being sort of a genderless form of king or queen, right? And the guru being kind of the shadow of that, like the tyrant king, as Moore would call it. So someone who thinks that they're in power over, right? I am the one doing the healing. You must conform to the way that I do it. I know, right? This kind of power differential, whereas the sovereign recognizes the sovereign in you and recognizes that you have everything you need to heal, right? And just kind of provides that sort of boundaried container mythically, right? It'd be a kingdom or a castle, like where that healing can occur, and knows that it's not them doing the healing, but actually your own inner sovereign. Like you are a sovereign being, I am a sovereign being, and we can relate to each other in that way. Another was what I call the eternal youth versus the wise elder. The eternal youth being someone who really wants the quick and easy path in this work, who wants to go to the weekend workshop and then put out their shingle as a psychedelic facilitator, or does a week-long training and then all of a sudden is a ascended master of Reiki or whatever. It's like we all have seen this. We all know what I'm talking about here, right?
We do.
Jesus, you live in Byron Bay. I don't need to tell you. So
exactly.
It's the lust for the shortcut, and to me, like anytime I kind of hear someone talking about psychedelics being used to optimize things or sort of like enhance their performance, it's like, ooh, to me that's a bit of a red flag, because it has some archetypal threads to that puer, that eternal youth, the puer eternus, right? Whereas the other end of that archetypal spectrum is the wise elder. It's someone who's been places and, has lost things and been in it for a while and has some scars and know what it's like to get burned, and doesn't need something from you, doesn't need that gratification from you to kind of enhance their narcissistic trip, as it were, right? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, you don't want to work with me? Great. Wonderful. Like, I'm good here. I don't need to prove anything. Which to me also speaks to the importance of training, really good training and really good mentorship in this field, which is, really hard to find and really lacking. And then that third kind of polarity, that archetypal polarity, is between what I call the dark sorcerer and the wounded healer. And the dark sorcerer is kind of that shadow magician that Robert Moore writes about a bit, that kind of, there's power there. There's power, but it's power out of balance. And it's power kind of used to unconsciously kind of extract something from those that are seeking healing. And the dark sorcerer kind of is wounded in themselves. And in fact, that wound is so kind of buried beneath shadow material that it's like this festering thing that actually permeates the experience. And I would say, there's a lot of unfortunate stories of abuse in psychedelic circles, and even like clinical trials. So it's, and then in therapy in general, like we all know that things like that happen, right? Therapists sleeping with their clients, or psychedelic facilitators or whatever, sexually abusing people. That to me is the dark sorcerer, because somewhere in the psyche there's a trip about power. That's a power trip. And there's perhaps even a story that like, oh, this is what you were wanting all along. This is going to heal you. This is the healing you really need, and I'm going to now give it to you. That's some sorcerer shit right there. Whereas the other end of the spectrum is the wounded healer, which is like, the wound is right there on the table, and you can tell, you can feel that with people, that vulnerability, that humanity right there, that humility as well. And yeah, there's room for grief with that kind of a person too, right? So that's
wow.
that's what I'll say.
Yeah, thanks, man. I mean, that's beautifully expressed, all of that. And for me, I'm sort of starting to feel a connection between the three myths that you outlined in your book, in your upcoming book as well. It seems like all these things are kind of weaving in together and they're all interconnected.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, and also, I guess, in a more practical sense too, just listening to you kind of outlining that in a more kind of mythic way, which again is so beautifully expressed. But it would then lead to maybe people listening saying, what kind of questions might I ask a potential, the psychedelic facilitator? And
Hmm.
some of those became obvious when you were speaking, like how long have you been doing this? But maybe there's some others that you might like to outline as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question, Asher. I mean, yeah, what's your training? You know, I I'll just share a quick story. Like I was contacted by some folks in California who we're starting a psychedelic community and church and wanted something from me. I don't know. And, it was like, all right, so you're starting an ayahuasca church. Great. What's your training in that tradition? Oh, I've been to a couple retreats in Costa Rica. It's great. All right. What's your relationship to any indigenous people of South America or the Amazon? None. Okay. What are your plans for reciprocity for any of those people? None. You know, whoa. So to me, at least, profoundly problematic. Um, the level of, extraction going on there. So questions like that, right? Like, what's your relationship to this? Like, how much skin do you have in the game? What's your investment in this? What's your investment with these communities or this tradition? Who are your colleagues, right? Like, who are your peers in this work? Which speaks to kind of like how robust is their accountability system? Do they even accept accountability and feedback? Like, are they surrounded by people who are, like going to offer them feedback? Um, and then, yeah, like this might be pushing it a little bit, but like, what does their life look like? Are they leading a life that feels um, inspiring and healthy and integrated to your perspective? One question that I love, and I can't remember who originally posed this, but it's like, do you think that this person could, help, in your healing process without the use of psychedelics at all? Like, is just this person and who they are enough?
Hmm.
You
Yeah,
know?
that is a beautiful question, isn't it? To kind of take the elephant in the room completely out of the room and just have a conversation with another human being. Are they supportive? It comes back to this idea of relationship, which I think is another beautiful thing about depth psychology in and of itself, is that there's a full awareness of that it's two people going into this situation and two people will be changed, rather
Yeah.
than just having the psychologist or the psychotherapist who's kind of is going to be stayed throughout the process. That this
Mm-hmm.
really is a kind of meeting of two people where transformation will happen for both.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm. So I guess from the psychedelic facilitator, are they willing to enter into a relationship like that?
Right. And then, you get into that whole process of like, what is it like to be in relationship with this person? You know, or do they relate in healthy ways? You know,
Mm,
um, or in healthy ways to the medicine? That's a big one. It's like, and this is where in being around indigenous teachers has been so valuable for me, because there's such the relationship to spirit and the relationship to the medicine is kind of like constantly in dialogue. It's constantly kind of up for renegotiation. It's constantly requiring maintenance, like any legitimate relationship. And, you know, I've met shamans or curanderos, whatever, who are, you know, have like lost their medicine, and they're like, yeah, you know, I lost my medicine, and I'm having to do these things to repair this. So I'm not doing a ceremony right now because, you know, I was off in some way. So I'm in this repair process, right? And like having that humility to be like, oh, I actually need to put this down for a while and do some other work.
Yeah, it's beautifully honest, isn't it? And I'm trying to equate it to perhaps a general physician or something here who might say, look, I'm putting down my tools for a few months. I'm just not connecting to my work at the moment. You're just not going to see that happen.
No.
Yeah. Or any profession, quite frankly, if you have a true relationship with it, absolutely. I wanted to backtrack for 1 second because I noticed a couple of times you've mentioned this idea of incorporating church into these facilitation retreats and things. And I think for Australians, we might not understand why that's important, but by making it a church, you sort of circumnavigate some legislation in the US. Is that correct? You're able to kind of serve medicine or do certain things, because I've noticed you mentioned this idea of church coming into it a couple of times, and I'm guessing that's what you're pointing towards, which is not a situation we have in Australia, I don't think.
So yeah. So first of all, like the legality of it is a big question mark. That is not my area of expertise. So I'll just say that, you know. I guess just to provide some like historical context for the church arguments around psychedelic use goes back to the Native American church, which is the peyote church. And it was actually in Oregon that a case was heard where a Native man, I believe, was fired from work because, and this was back in the 80s, I think. He had his employer asked him what he was doing the night before. He was like, well, I got a peyote ceremony. I'm a part of the Native American church. Fired him. Guy took it all the way to the Supreme Court for freedom of religion and won. And so that court case set a precedent for peyote to be used as a sacrament in the Native American church. Now, there are a lot of, I would say, like misappropriations of that currently happening. There's a lot of very legitimate practitioners, and of course, the Native American church is the beautiful, you know, powerful tradition that is very much walking the talk, you know. And there are some other kind of like somewhat offshoots of that. The Church of the Eagle and the Condor, started by Dr. Joe Tafur, is another one that's really doing some incredible work, you know. So there are some really beautiful and legitimate pathways for that happening here in the States because of freedom of religion. However, there's also a lot of bullshit and people kind of appropriating that title. So you know, it's a precarious legal situation, at least here. I don't know in Australia how that would play out.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I've certainly read a little about what you're talking about in the US, but I'm not quite sure what the situation is in Australia. But nonetheless, you know, we have these legislations coming in a couple of months, so we're kind of we're at a kind of, as I said before, we're at a kind of nexus point at the moment, which is why this conversation is so pertinent right now. So I really appreciate you being here. And I was just thinking about Terence McKenna when you were talking about the churches there, when he said something like, truth doesn't require your participation, bullshit does.
Yes. Or another Terence quote we could whip out is avoid gurus, follow plants.
Yeah. Simple, right?
Yes.
And there's a lovely little point that he's making there that one is not the other, you know, because there is a situation where your plant can become your guru, you know, and that's something else that you talk to. It's like, when does microdosing become something else?
Totally. Yeah. When does microdosing become just another pill you take that is going to fix your problems, right?
Mm, mm,
Along with your morning regiment of whatever.
mm. Not to mention, that's no longer a microdose, my friend.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Yes.
interesting. And I guess you talked about the relationship that the practitioner has, and I'm wondering if it's okay to ask, like, what's your personal relationship with plant medicine, and how has that changed over the years? Is there anything that you happy to share?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. Um, what I can share is like I've been blessed to have had um yeah, intimate experiences with, people from a variety of traditions where I was able to connect with them as people, and get to know them and their culture, in a context of ceremony or a context of learning or both. And, through that kind of made a relationship to an actual human being. Some of those folks I haven't seen in years, especially folks down in the Amazon. But it's the kind of thing where it's like, I know if I wanted to go and find Don Miguel again and hang out with him, like 100%, like we would pick it up right where we left off, because we connected as humans, as human beings, and not just that, but he and his brother Don Enrique, were gracious enough to like share their tradition in a context specifically, for that. So yeah, and then as as far it's interesting because as a white Westerner, right, it's like, oh, this isn't my culture, this isn't my tradition, this isn't my medicine to pick up, and for me, like, pick up and carry. And so yeah, how to relate to that respectfully to me and what feels good for me, right? And it's just slow, I think anyone who's spent time in indigenous spaces can speak to kind of the different orientation around time. And it's like, no, we're gonna take a long time here. And I'm working with a native teacher here in the Northwest, and when I started working with him in this group, it was like, yeah, just a small commitment of 2 years is
Mm,
what we ask, you know.
yeah.
And and I like that. It's like 2 years is nothing in
Mm,
that kind of perspective, in that kind of a culture. So, but again, to also uh, not make them not get confused that just because there's a relationship that it's somehow mine, which brings me back to actually depth psychology and myth, because myth is for everyone and story is for everyone. And specifically, depth psychology, like, personally, I feel like I can claim, because it comes from a tradition of European, you know, uh, intellectual whatever that is like in my lineage culturally, and yet speaks to this collective element that myth invites us into.
mm,
So
mm.
yeah.
I love that. That's beautiful, and I think we can all find a connection there. I mean, for me, on my father's side, I'm very connected to Celtic mythology, and on my mother's side, I get this wonderful Russian um, aspect. So, I feel when I hear stories that are talking to either of those two lineages, I feel very deeply entwined in them. It's a beautiful
Mm-hmm.
thing. So, we can all find our way, as you say. Myths, they're timeless, but um, they're also yes, for everybody, and I think that's a beautiful way of looking at it. But then, and maybe this leads me on to a question. Maybe working with psychedelic medicine with plant medicine isn't for everybody. And I think I might have heard you
No,
speak to that a little bit as well. So, you know, and whether that's about your current mindset or whether it's actually something much deeper than that, there's probably some aspects I'd love you to talk to that.
for sure. Yeah. I mean, Jung would say that, you know, psychedelics require a certain level of ego strength because they kind of severely decompensate the ego. And if someone's ego, by the way, like ego isn't a bad word, right? It's just an element of the psyche in which like we're having this conversation right now through the ego. The ego writes the book. The ego pays bills, you know? So, but if, you know, I think we've all maybe met people, right? Where it's like that ego is shaky. It's on shaky ground. And if that's the case, then like, I don't know if psychedelics are going to be supportive in that situation because it's like you would just be sort of poking something that's already quite fragile, you know. So as far as the, you know, hard lines go with psychedelics, and most facilitators, including myself, like schizophrenia or even a family history of schizophrenia, and that's, you know, there's all of these things are up for debate, right? This is the thing. There's so much under researched areas of psychedelic work. So right now we have these like broad sweeping statements like people with a family history of schizophrenia or bipolar shouldn't take psychedelics. That's kind of industry standard. On the other hand, I have close friends who have an immediate family history of schizophrenia who take a lot of psychedelics and they're okay. But again, I'm not endorsing that. I'm just saying the research shows, and then the industry standards basically is that if you do have schizophrenia, bipolar in your family line, then psychedelics may not be for you. Alternatively, I would also, or not alternatively, additionally, I would also say, you know, people in crisis, psychedelics are not going to give you more stability. They're going to shake things up even more. So, you know, it's a thing I think we can probably both see in our respective communities of kind of people thinking that psychedelics are going to somehow like resolve the crisis for them or somehow like help get them out of whatever difficult emotional situation they're in, you know. Like, I think it's a good question to ask yourself before taking any drug or substance, like, am I taking this to feel something other than what I'm feeling right now? Like, am I taking this because I don't want to be sad? Because if that's the case, then like you might want to pause and reconsider.
That is such an important message, Simon. Thank you for sharing that. You know, and it does come back to ego. You're right. You know, and I think looking at ego is not a good thing or a bad thing. But I like to talk about, you know, ego maturity as opposed to too much or too little. It's really that, and that's the strength of it you're talking about there is, do we have a mature ego or an immature one? You know, like I love the metaphor of the balloon. There's this idea that, you know, if the ego is a metaphorical balloon, you can have too much air in it or too little, you know, and you can see the consequences of either, which is interesting. But yeah, and I think, you know, I'm thinking about my role too in terms of meditation and other modalities as well. I mean, you could apply the same principles. You know, it's like if you're coming into meditation because you want to achieve a certain outcome, like be happier or have less depression, or it's probably not going to do that for you. You know, it's like,
Right.
yeah, like meditation is just a great thing to do, and it should be incorporated in your daily life if possible. The anything that happens is just a side effect of showing up for that practice every day. You know, and so for me, I like to say surrender the agenda, and I don't know if that's maybe applicable in the world of psychedelics as well.
I think so. You know, it's something that I've seen, you know, a lot of in my work down in Jamaica, running psilocybin retreats, you know, which would cater to a wide variety of people from all types of backgrounds, some of them being, pretty big money backgrounds, right? Where there's this notion that it's, I'm going to pay this amount of money, so I want this amount of healing, or I'm taking this many mushrooms, so I want this much revelation, and kind of this like transaction, right? And something that I think one of the massive teachings that I took away from my time in Jamaica was this idea of relationship versus transaction. And it's so easy because we live in a transactional culture to approach psychedelics, just like you're saying with meditation, from this transactional point of view. Like, well, I took the thing, so I want this. This is what you said. It's supposed to be 10 years of therapy and whatever. And like, so give me that. I want the thing. But they do not play by those rules.
Mm. Yeah, I even hear, the traditional psychiatrists and psychologists speaking in that way. Often you hear this sort of trope that, oh, one, trip is equivalent to like 10 years of therapy, and it's so black and
Totally.
white. It's so black and white.
Yeah.
It's just, it's like, it almost makes me smile in a kind of strange way, because it's so,
Yeah.
again, it just, yeah, well, I mean, you've spoken to it beautifully, this idea of transaction versus relationship.
Yeah. And, sometimes it is like that. Sometimes it is like 10 years of therapy in one go. And I've seen that happen for people. And I think that sort of trope, as you said, is giving people unrealistic expectations. Yeah.
Well, and you're right. It can happen. I mean, I've actually seen it in my own life. I mean, I can point to, a certain evening, taking the medicine, which really has changed my life. But I can talk to many more that weren't so profound.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Especially the ones at the concerts with, after a couple beers, right?
Well, but again, this is, but yeah. But Simon, this is so interesting to me, is about intentionality, which is different from having an agenda, in the sense that, you can work with the same plant, like perhaps, and I'm sure you too, brother, although I won't make any claims to know, but that idea of taking some mushrooms and going to see a concert. What I'm looking for is, make the music better, make the lights look amazing, make put a smile on my face, and versus how I would enter that situation now, same plant, completely different intention, and different outcome.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
So I find that fascinating too, that it tends to work in such mysterious ways when it comes down to our own intention. It's almost like there's a relationship and communication happening there before anything even begins.
It does. That these medicines do work in mysterious ways, and just to kind of bring back a mythopoetic lens to this, right? Like that mysterious way, that unpredictability, right? Sometimes you think you're going to get the 10 years of therapy, and you get the kind of crawling on the floor wishing it would end, right? It's like there's this, you don't know when you open that door. And to me, that is just 100% trickster. And so, I love thinking about psychedelics as trickster beings that are kind of, mushrooms literally like emerge out of concrete sometimes, like just busting through out of nowhere, and are liminal entities in and of themselves, and they're sort of in between nature as a fungal species, fungal kingdom, right? They're not a plant, they're not an animal, they're their own thing. They're intermediaries between other beings through their mycelial networks. They're intermediating something for us, right, with something that is not us. And they're totally unpredictable, like you said. And I like to think of them, especially in this new age that we're in, right, with everything happening where I live here in Oregon and soon to be in Australia, right? Like this rollout of like, oh, here's psychedelics and here's how they work, and here's this little box, and we're going to put it in our little sort of cultural philosophical frame of what it is. And to me, it's almost like the alien in the James Cameron or the Ridley Scott movies, right? Like it's like the most basic version of that story, every single movie is like, oh, we found an alien. It's a mysterious, intense, scary thing. We're going to try to contain it so that we can use it for something. And then what happens? The alien always escapes. And that's like the entire crux of the story, is that the alien always gets out. And I feel like that's the case with psychedelics too. And I could talk more about that and the history of psychedelic counterculture and how it literally escaped the lab and all of that. So
yeah, it's inherently, you know, archetypally free, right? So it just simply will not be contained in a box. And as you know, you talked about the word unpredictable. I mean, you can't, you know, its very nature is you can't make something that's unpredictable predictable. That's it wouldn't be very unpredictable then, would it?
no, and you know, there's all these kind of companies, all these psychedelic pharmaceutical companies is basically what they are, trying to develop things, you know, more predictable, sort of neutered versions of psychedelic compounds, right? To kind of break them like you would break a wild horse to our will through chemical engineering and all of that. And that's makes me a little sad. You know, I think there's some applications for these things, right? Like children with epilepsy and things like that. Like that's great, wonderful. Though I think most of this research is kind of this trying to contain these molecules by just sort of the myth of reductionism. Like, let's just disconnect this from its nature as much as possible.
Decaffeinated coffee.
Decaf coffee, yeah.
It's like taking the very essence of the coffee bean out and serving it up. Oh, that's interesting, man. I've so enjoyed this conversation, and you know, I think you know, I'd love to just let people in our community know that, Simon, you know, you're joining us next month to bring that mythopoetic integration workshop to our community, and I just want to say I'm really humbled, really grateful, and just so thankful that you've you know, put your hand up to do that. It's just a beautiful thing. So thank you, brother.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Asher. Yeah, it means a lot, and I'm excited and looking forward to connecting with everyone. And yeah, it'll be great.
Well, I'm hoping for those listening, this has been a nice little kind of entree, if you will, to the workshop, which I know is going to be amazing. And Simon, you know, I'd love it if you could join us in other ways in our community, because I think your wisdom is so profound. You know, there's so much that you can offer us. It's just, you know, it feels like you're one of us, brother. You know, it's like I think you would thrive in our community, and like I said, you have so much to give. But I also know you're a very, very busy man. Like this type of work is in demand, and particularly your voice, having so much experience in this world. So I know you've got a lot on your plate. So anything that you can give us is beautifully received at this end.
Thanks, man. Yeah. Well, you know, it's like I said, it's like work like you're doing and communities like Fifth Direction and the devotion and the celebration of kind of the mythopoetic tradition, right? And the depth tradition and the celebration and value of story and myth that is so near and dear to my heart. You know, it's like the mythopoetic tradition feels like home to me. So, you know, and that home can be doesn't matter if it's in Australia or Oregon or whatever. So.
Oh, I think that's a beautiful place to end it. It's feeling like home. So thanks for joining us, man, and we look forward to seeing you in the workshop.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much, Asher.